out of the necessities of practice, particularly in the violent zones of the Colombian interior. Hakol, which wrote the book on this approach, discovered that involving residents in decisions affecting their lives was the best protection against the violence that was constantly threatening the firm's operation. It therefore adopted a consciously participatory strategy, encouraging the development of grassroots leaders and taking advantage of Colombia's innovative 1991 constitution, which called for the creation of local elected boards, juntas de acción comunal, in rural areas throughout the country. Hakol has been teaching the Constitution to the community, is how this leader of the company has put it. They build these constitutionally sanctioned local boards and then rely on them to get priorities for the company's social engagement work. But this participatory dimension is just the tip of the iceberg of what is missing from the MBA approach. In the context of Latin America and perhaps following the economic crisis of 2007 to 2009, maybe 2011 now, this MBA approach, it just rings a bit hollow. This is so in important part because attitudes towards the business community in this region are still strained. There's a long history, as you well know, of hostility to business among Latin intellectuals and the public at large, and a kind of deep social chasm. And therefore, the persuasiveness of the business case for corporate social responsibility, when it's heard by these other elements of the society, is a potential turnoff. A too utilitarian and self-serving an approach to social engagement can therefore backfire, intensifying suspicions rather than inspiring gratitude. What this suggests is not that the MBA approach is wrong. There has to be a payoff to social engagement for the companies. But in a context like the one that exists in Latin America, a context that may have become more common, as I indicate, as a result of our recent global financial meltdown, there's a need for other elements beyond those highlighted by the MBA approach for judging the seriousness and potentially the effectiveness of corporate social engagement. To capture these other elements, as Mariana has indicated, this little book that I've written, and there are flyers, I think, out there. It's called Rethinking Corporate Social Engagement. This is an example of the flyer. It suggests a different model, a different paradigm for organizing our thinking about the modalities of corporate social responsibility. I call it the corporate social engagement pyramid. And this pyramid has a number of different levels. The first two levels are very consistent with the MBA approach. And all of these levels, in English at least, start with the letter P, so it's easy to remember them. Apparently one of them doesn't work in Spanish, but I think the other four do. The first level is proliferation, the spreading of corporate social engagement, the broadening of the base, so that it's not simply a narrow band of large families that are doing philanthropy, but a very much broader array of companies. The second is professionalization, that is the replacement of the ad hoc and personal character of business philanthropy by a more structured and a more permanent process with dedicated staff, with transparent guidelines, with structured access points, and with a strategic focus. But then this pyramid goes off the MBA train and adds three new elements. Not entirely new to be sure, but three new emphases. One of those is partnering. Partnering is the active engagement and empowerment of communities in the identification of corporate social engagement objectives and the design of social engagement initiatives around those community priorities. This is a direct challenge to the MBA approach, which assumes that the task of formulating corporate social engagement strategies should be left fundamentally in the hands of business leaders and their consultants, who alone understand corporate business strategies and can therefore align corporate social engagement initiatives with them. So this really turns that on its head. And the reason is quite simple, that for better or worse, the Latin American poor are demanding more of a say over the forces affecting their lives than the traditional MBA model seems to acknowledge. And populations in other parts of the world are not far behind. The second addition to the MBA model suggested by this corporate social engagement pyramid is partnership, is participation. This was, you have to reverse them. The third one was participation, the fourth one is partnering. And the reason that's important is that anybody who's a close observer of this field realizes that no single company can solve any of the major problems of these societies or of our world today if they act on their own. It conveys the impression that they're not serious about really gaining traction on the problems. The only way to demonstrate real evidence of seriousness to gain real traction on problems is to get together and get a scale of operation going that gives some hope of making a difference. To be sure, some adherents to the MBA approach acknowledge the importance of partnerships, but their tendency is to focus on partnerships among companies, when in fact what's really needed are broader partnerships that engage in not only the companies, but also the civil society sector that has emerged and has great vitality in this region. Finally, the third addition to the MBA model reflects the realization that the real payoff from corporate social responsibility comes not from what corporations do in society, but what they do in their own businesses. Despite the hype, the resources devoted to corporate social engagement are still rather limited compared to the resources that companies utilize in their own basic business operations. To be successful, therefore, it's not enough that corporate social engagement work externally to the companies. For corporations to pursue it really seriously, it needs to be brought into the firm, pursuing irresponsible or unfortunate behavior or utilizing the firm itself to promote the goals of social engagement. And so I then set out to ask myself, how far have Latin American companies moved in implementing this broadened notion of corporate social engagement? How far up the ladder have they proceeded? And the answer I came to was actually quite far. Looking at particularly the countries of Latin America that I mentioned before. I'll focus my attention on the top three, but let me just say a couple of words about the bottom two levels of this pyramid, because there's some really interesting things going on, particularly in the professionalization level. And one of the interesting developments that I think is novel in this region, not unique but still quite interesting, is the way in which companies have begun to utilize their own personnel of the company in the corporate social engagement activity. Two examples stand out in my mind of interesting ways that companies have done it. One of them is Bank Galicia in Argentina, which is a bank that was in great difficulty in the early part of the turn of the century in 2000, 2002, when the Argentinian economy almost went bust and the bank was losing customers. And in that context, on their own, the workers of this company began to do volunteer work to help the people who were formerly customers of the bank but who were in great economic trouble. And the bank leadership saw this and saw that it was bringing the customers back. They were beginning to connect to the bank in a special way. And the bank therefore came up with an entire strategy in which they emphasized the bank's role as a value producer in the community. And then they did something really extraordinary. They created a separate NGO, a separate non-governmental organization that was designed specifically to handle all the bank's philanthropic activity, all of its social corporate responsibility activity. And then they set up the board of directors so that it was dominated by the employees of the company, of the bank. And so here you had the entire corporate social engagement activity and philanthropic agenda of the bank being set by the employees, a really novel use, engagement of the employees. A second example is Microsoft Colombia, which took that even a step further. There are only two people running the whole Colombia corporate social engagement, corporate philanthropy activity. The way they extend their reach is by forming committees that are made up of employees but each of the committees in each of the substantive areas is headed by a family member of one of the employees. And so it may be the wife of some manager of a department who becomes the head of the committee to guide the corporate activity of Microsoft in the education area, and somebody else doing their health work. And in this way, they have really connected the entire family to the company and produced a level of commitment to that company that's really unusual. So those are a couple things in the professionalization. Let me just move on to the participation area of this pyramid. This is the way that companies can overcome the paternalism that at times has characterized philanthropy in this region. It leads to an empowering form of behavior. And I've already described the early work of Hakol, the Colombian oil company in the town of San Francisco. But this turns out just to have been the beginning of this company's participatory work. Prompted by the violence in many of the areas where it was operating, Hakol formulated an entire program of leadership development, grassroots organizing, reliance on the local population for supplies for the work that was being done. Close cooperation with community councils mandated by the Colombian Constitution. In the process, Hakol rebranded itself. It rebranded its mission statement and its language in explaining its role in the world. It began to issue annual reports in which it used the tagline, "A company that shares in the life of Colombia." A company that shares in the life of Colombia. Their goal was to eliminate this distance between the company and the people by emphasizing the fact that they are with the people and they are a part of Colombia, all to emphasize this participatory approach. The payoffs from this approach proved to be substantial, so the company did get better off economically. Alone among oil companies, Hakol has been able to work in the zones of violence in Colombia. And over time, of course, other oil companies took notice and began to emulate these practices. And in response, Hakol joined with other Colombian oil companies to form what's called the Association of Oil Foundations of Colombia, and has used this vehicle to help spread the technique of participatory development to other oil companies. And not surprisingly, other companies in other fields began to take notice and to realize that strategies of empowerment really can work. One of the companies that picked up this message was Klabin, the largest producer and exporter of paper products in Brazil. And because paper production is an industry with a typically heavy environmental and social footprint, one might have expected Klabin to be caught up in the winds of environmental and social concerns sweeping through Brazil in the 1990s. But well into the new century, Klabin remained a corporate backwater, a traditional family-owned business operating in 15 isolated communities with a highly dependent population that appeared satisfied with the company's ad hoc social assistance mode, or at least had little opportunity to change it. But early in the new century, the company ran into some serious economic problems. It had to sell off a number of assets, and new leadership came in, and the board came to recognize that the company's international image as an exploiter of forests needed to change. It therefore made a very bold leap and reached outside of its existing personnel to recruit a man named Gilberto Luis Lima, who was a corporate communications director from another company who had earned a reputation as an innovator of social programs. So here's a company recognizing that its economic future depended on its changing its image. And they named this guy to be the first director of communications and social responsibility. And they put him on the management committee of the company so that he was integrated into the decision process of the company. In quick succession, Lima proposed two major initiatives. First, that Klabin transform itself from an environmental deadbeat into an environmental leader, and second, that the company give a more coherent structure to its ad hoc and unfocused philanthropic activities. To make headway on the first, he convinced the Klabin board to bring the company into compliance with the new set of forestry preservation standards developed by the Forest Stewardship Council, an international council that created a set of standards. And soon, 3 of its products were the first in the world to be registered as meeting these certification requirements. But it's really the second objective that is particularly of interest to us here. He took an even more unorthodox approach to giving a strategy to his corporate engagement activity. He retained a consulting group in Brazil, a nonprofit consulting group called the Institute for Development and Social Investment, headed by Marcos Kiesel, a former Kellogg Foundation executive and a Brazilian, to help the company to decide how to spend an $11 million fund that Brazil's National Bank of Social and Economic Development required Klabin to invest in community improvements as part of a loan that the bank extended to the company for a major expansion project in one of Klabin's plants. Rather than conduct the typical top-down needs assessment, IDIS, this consulting firm, urged Lima to adopt an unconventional bottom-up approach and throw the decisions into the hands of local residents, exactly the reverse of what the MBA approach recommends. The Klabin board initially threw up their hands and said, this is crazy, this is our money, why should we turn it over to the community? But they were ultimately persuaded. And there then transpired a 2-year process of discovery and community organizing involving community surveys and in-depth consultations with local residents, the formation of community-based steering committees involving Klabin employees, but also local municipal leaders and civil society leaders, and then the creation of 6 working groups that were charged to formulate concrete projects in 6 areas, such as water and environment, entrepreneurship, culture, sports. And it was an enlivening experience for everybody. This community came alive as a result of this process. A third example is the Holcim Ortopolis program. Holcim Brazil is a subsidiary of a huge international cement and concrete factory based in Switzerland. It acquired a plant in Barroso, a town in Brazil, in 1996. The Barossa plant had already shrunk from about 1,200 employees in the 1980s to 650 when Holcim bought it. And Holcim then introduced an automation process that reduced the number to 150. Get Holcim up here. And since the former owners lived in this town, were known to people, engaged in a whole variety of philanthropy activities, Holcim came into this town with a huge black mark over its activities. And rather than turn its back on the situation or respond defensively, Holcim responded with a good offense. It was inspired by the work of Klabin, it was inspired by the work of Hakol, and it decided therefore to create a bottom-up planning process. It launched a process called the Ortopolis Project, or the Sustainable City Program, a participatory development process aimed at establishing a consensus model of this town's future. And again, the same model. It convened a community planning group. They created 9 working groups. They identified action priorities. These groups then began to start projects. Some of the money came from the Inter-America Foundation. And suddenly, they turned around a situation that could have been a disaster for this company by engaging the community. Another example that I won't go into detail on is the example of Banamex, a Mexican bank, which was persuaded by Vicente Fox to participate in an effort to revitalize rural marginal communities. And again, Banamex reacted not simply by sending money, but by beginning a process of community organizing, bottom up from the very beginning, with wonderful effects. So what we have here is a different model that is participatory, that engages people. And we have examples in Latin America of companies that are doing this. In fact, the Inter-America Foundation has created an entire network that now involves 60 companies that have developed training materials on how to do this kind of bottom-up participatory development. And it is, I think, having an enormous effect. As I say, 60 companies across the region are active members. They've created materials that can be used in any country. And if you're not engaged with Ready America, I would encourage you to do so. But participation is just one of the novel elements of that Latin American companies have brought to their corporate social engagement work. The next one in this process is partnering. And partnering is the process of reaching out to other entities and bringing them into the process of engagement in what a particular company is doing this. And we have many examples in Latin America of the attempts by companies not simply to do something in their own bailiwick and not simply to do something on their own, but to reach out and form a network to tackle a really serious problem. One of the best examples is the organization formed by a group of companies in Colombia called Empresas por la Educación, EXE for short, Companies for Education. This is a network of over 100 member corporations that have taken upon themselves the total reform of the Colombian education system. They've reached the conclusion that the education system is simply not progressing at the level that is needed by the business community. And instead of doing this project and that project, they have formed a coalition and they have developed a whole strategy. They call themselves a second floor organization, by which they mean that the EXE is not itself carrying out projects. It is like a contracting firm that is engaging groups of corporations in other parts of the country to take on specific projects to improve the schools in their particular regions, but all under the umbrella of EXE. There are examples. So far, I have to say that in my research, I discovered that the companies were having a much easier time cooperating and partnering with each other than they were partnering with other nonprofit organizations. And the reason for that is that there are some significant barriers to the partnerships between civil society and business that need to be addressed. There are historic tensions, as we all know, between business and civil society. There are corporate concerns about the capacity of nonprofit organizations. There is growing in the region something that I've called the cult of the Empresa, the sense that business can really do this all itself, which makes it difficult to convince business leaders to reach out to the nonprofit organizations. There's significant distrust on the part of nonprofits towards business. And there are very gross imperfections in what we can think of as the collaboration marketplace, the opportunities that these two sides, business and civil society, have to come together. And those, I think, are serious impediments to achieving the collaborations and partnerships that I think are called for. Let me then turn to the third step of this pyramid, which is in a way the most important and the most powerful. At the end of the day, as I indicated, the highest form of corporate social engagement occurs not when corporations do something external to the firm, important though that is, but when they allow their social engagement priorities to penetrate the internal operations of their firms, into their business functions and product lines. And there are striking examples of this that I think are evident throughout the Latin American region. And it takes many different forms, three particular forms that I think are worth paying attention to. So the word that's being used to signify this new approach, this penetration approach, is the term sustainability. There is a whole sustainability council at the global level, and there are Latin American leaders who have embraced this notion that it's really the holistic, total reality of the firm's operations that should be the focus. And so you have people like the head of Grupo Nueva, Stefan Schmidheiny, and Julio Mora, another business leader, making the case that there's a need for a much more business approach, utilizing the business community to serve the objectives of corporate social engagement. And this can take, as I say, a number of different forms. So one of those forms is the changing of production functions and production processes. One of the examples that I like very strongly is the example of the ABN AMRO Real Bank in Brazil. It was formed in 1998 out of the merger of ABN AMRO, the big Dutch bank, and Brazil's Banco Real. And to forge these two entities into a single unit, Fabio Barbosa, who was the CEO of the newly merged firm, decided that he had to foster a new corporate culture to weld the parts of this company together. And he came up with the theme of a quote, new bank for a new society. And he began to call his bank a bank of value that was contributing value in many forms to the community. The central idea was the idea of a bank that created value for the entire community and that internalized in its business operations the value-creating impulses that were embodied in its social engagement activities, including concern for the environment, concern for the poor, human rights. In short, Barbosa determined to make the thoroughgoing penetration of social objectives into the business functions of the firm the defining feature of the new company. So this essentially, again, turns the MBA approach on its head. Instead of having the business strategy dictate the philanthropic strategy, here he's having the philanthropic strategy dictate the business strategy. Initially, the bank managers were stumped about how a bank could manifest its social and environmental commitments in its business activities, since banks have a relatively limited environmental impact, for example. But then they had an epiphany. While the bank itself might not have a sizable social or environmental impact, the projects it finances certainly do. If environmental impacts could be incorporated into the bank's loan risk criteria, then the impact could be enormous, especially if other banks began to follow suit. What is more, the bank realized that it could do the same with other types of risk criteria, for example, those relating to other social impacts, hiring practices, training for the disadvantaged. So armed with this insight, the bank approached a nonprofit, Friends of the Earth, which had expertise in assessing environmental risks, to assist it in developing a set of environmental risk criteria that would become every bit as important in the bank's lending decisions as its economic risk criteria. It simply added another set of risk criteria. And to train bank loan officers in the application of these criteria. And the bank also developed, as I said, similar risk criteria. And then it advertised itself to its population, saying, we are a bank of value. Everything we do in our business is done with the value foremost. And we have procedures in place that will evaluate the loans that we're going to give, not simply in terms of their economic value, which is important, but also in terms of their environmental risk. A second example of this phenomenon is a company called Macisa I think in Chile. This is a furniture company bought by Schmidt-Heine, this man that I mentioned before, who decided that he was going to demonstrate that it was possible to have a forest products firm that operated according to the highest principles of forest management as well as worker safety and environmental and social impact. And he worked for 4 or 5 years and produced in Macisa a firm that really has embodied in its business. And the head of the person, the sustainability officer, put it this way. He says, Macisa does not have a project. We don't have a corporate social responsibility project. The whole business is the project. The whole business is the project. And she went on to say, foundations are terrible. Foundations are not part of a core business. You must ask yourself, how do you make the money? And then build your social engagement into that. This is not a project. We do the business differently. A second way that this can be done is through supply chain management, and I know we're running out of time, so this will be my last example. Supply chain is one of the most powerful tools that a corporation has to influence its environment. By consciously using the supply chain and managing it for social objectives, a company can have powerful impacts, both positive by purchasing certain things from certain suppliers that yield social benefits, and by choosing not to buy certain products because they're produced in a way that's environmentally harmful. And there have been a number of very interesting cases of this. in Latin America, probably the most remarkable of which is the case of Walmart Brazil. Because Walmart discovered that it simply could not operate in Brazil the way it operates in other parts of the world. It had acquired about 280, close to 300 stores by the middle 200s, 206, and it lacked the supply chain that could achieve the kind of mass marketing that it uses in its other outlets. What's more, the transportation system wasn't up to operating the way it operates elsewhere. Rather than simply giving up on it or importing everything, Brazil made the decision to use its supply chain to transform the Brazilian economy, and particularly the agricultural economy. And therefore they created a network of what they called producer clubs. And the producer clubs would gather farmers in a particular region, and they would send out to these farmers essentially something akin to what in our country we call county agents, which are people who are expert in the operation of agriculture, got a little competition up there, who taught the farmers how to, what crops to to plant, and how to deal with fertilizer, and how to build facilities that would keep the product from being destroyed and not kept safe. They developed a whole series of procedures, not only in the agricultural arena, but also in the artisan arena. And over time, in a period of 5 years, really Walmart Brazil had transformed the entire agriculture system of Brazil by taking the time to utilize their supply chain management. There are other illustrations of this penetration approach, but let me bring this to a close. The central point that I promised I would convey to you is that really something important is underway in the business community of Latin America, a new type of corporate social engagement. It's not yet clear whether this is a systemic shift or a mere niche phenomenon. So the jury is out. But for all its limitations, the corporate social engagement movement in this region has generated just enormous energy, produced some highly useful results. And the Latin American business community, all of you have found ways to extend the corporate social engagement concept well beyond its MBA roots, its Masters of Business Administration roots, establishing in the process its own distinctive Latin style that's more participatory, that's more collaborative, that's more holistic than elsewhere, and that is penetrating the business side of business operations and not just the philanthropic side. In the process, I think it's creating a pathway for transforming the relationship between business and the society, and ultimately perhaps in transforming the society itself. And it's a model that Guatemalan businesses, if you have not already observed and absorbed, would be well to follow up on. Thank you very much.